Clarissa Barton was born on Christmas Day, 1821, in North Oxford, Massachusetts, to Stephen and Sarah Barton. She was the youngest in a family of 7. Her father was a farmer, state legislator, and veteran of the Revolutionary War. As the youngest of 5 siblings, she endured the typical sibling hazing, an example being her elder brothers tying her up and dragging her around Frozen Pond. In her childhood, Clara was quite shy and timid. Her parents sent her to a private boarding school, however her abnormal behavior became detrimental to her health. This led to her parents taking her out of school and to a phrenologist. A phrenologist examines the shape of the head and links it to a person's psychological characteristics and intellect. After examining her head shape, the phrenologist proclaims,
"The sensitive nature will always remain. She will never assert herself for herself. She will suffer wrong first, but for others she will be perfectly fearless. Throw responsibility upon her."
At the age of 11, Clara demonstrates this by taking over primary care of her ill brother and assisting her neighbors who had smallpox. Throughout her childhood, Clara suffered through bouts of depression.
I have found it extremely hard to restrain the tears today, and would have given almost anything to have been alone and undisturbed. I have seldom felt more friendless, and I believe I ever feel enough so. I see less and less in the world to live for, and in spite of all my resolution and reason and moral courage and everything else, I grow weary and impatient. I know it is wicked and perhaps foolish, but I cannot help it.
At the end of her childhood, Clarissa's parents persuaded her to become a teacher, and in 1838, she became an educator.
Clarissa worked as an educator for 12 years. In the early 1850s, she campaigned to open the first free public school in the state of New Jersey. The school was a great success. Clara was well respected by her students, both male and female, which was unusual for the time. By the end of the year, the school had over 600 students and needed an official principal. Unfortunately, due to gender discrimination, the job was given to a man and Clara was forced out. Clara was a strong believer in feminist rights.
I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay.
After her dismissal from the school, she decided to take a trip to Washington, D.C. She found work at the patent office as a confidential clerk. She became the first woman to receive the same pay rate as a man in a permanent government position. Being a female and receiving equal pay as her fellow male colleagues, she received a lot of discrimination, including having tobacco spat on her, smoke blown in her face, and verbal abuse. This treatment forced her outside of the office to work by candlelight in her small boarding room.
September 28, 1856. Secretary McClellan commented upon the most vulnerable points, something like a year ago, when he removed us ladies and, partially succeeding in his attempts, has been enlarging his graph ever since.
At the beginning of the Civil War, riots were breaking in Baltimore. President Lincoln called for volunteers to subdue the riots. It just so happened that the first responders were from the 6th Massachusetts, most of which were former students of Clara's. Upon hearing that her students were injured, she rushed to their aid. When she arrived, she discovered that the wounded were insufficiently cared for due to lack of supplies and resources. After witnessing the lack of medical readiness, Clara set out to gather equipment and supplies for the troops. The Civil War began. In 1862, Clara came to the front lines, bringing with her the many materials she had gathered pre-war. During the war, Clara performed many duties, including tending to the wounded, cleaning the field hospitals, cooking for the troops and wounded, and changing dressings in the field hospitals. Clara worked very close to the front lines and even had a few near-death experiences. In 1864, Clara was appointed lady in charge of the hospitals. She then became known as the Angel of the Battlefield. After the end of the American Civil War, Clara was horrified to discover that thousands of letters from family members of missing soldiers were going unanswered. She then took it upon herself to answer them and find their missing relative, dead or alive. She even took it so far as to write President Lincoln and was thus appointed to be the leader of the Office of the Missing Soldiers. In the next 4 years, Clara worked to properly bury and identify 22,000 missing soldiers. After the search for the missing men, Clara spent a few years lecturing about her experiences in the war and contributing to the women's suffrage movement.
In 1869, Clara took a break. She traveled to Europe and ended up in Geneva, Switzerland. Here she met Dr. Louis Appia and learned about the International Red Cross. The Red Cross was the idea of Henri Dunant, who wanted to outline rules for during conflict. His goal was to have volunteers operate under a universal set of rules, allowing them to treat the wounded on the battlefield. His proposal brought about the Geneva Conventions of 1864, where a treaty was created that said, during wartime, medical and nursing personnel would not be targeted, therefore granting them neutral status. These personnel would then be able to aid wounded combatants from both sides without fear of being targeted. In 1870, at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War, Clara began working with the Red Cross to organize the rescue effort. At the end of the war, Clara was recognized with the honorable decorations of the Golden Cross of Baden and the Prussian Iron Cross. She then traveled back to the States. Inspired from her time in Geneva, Clara returns to the United States and attempts to create the American Red Cross branch. In 1878, she meets with President Hayes about forming the American Red Cross. Her proposal was denied due to his belief that there will never be another American war. Clara attempted to form the American Red Cross again with President Garfield. However, he was assassinated before he could formally agree to the proposal. Ultimately, it took Clara 10 years of lobbying before President Arthur accepted her proposal on the grounds that the American Red Cross will prioritize on humanitarian missions rather than war. Clara became the first president of the American Red Cross in 1881. During her time there, she refused to take a salary for her work. Under her leadership, the organization was responsible for responding to many disasters across America and internationally. These disasters included the 1881 Michigan fires, the 1884 Mississippi floods, the 1889 Pennsylvania dam break, the 1892 Russian famine, the 1893 South Carolina hurricane, the 1896 Turkish and American relief, the 1900 Texas hurricane, and the Spanish-American War. In 1804, Clara finally resigned from her position. In her retirement, she continued to give lectures and remained active in the humanitarian community. Her memoir, titled The Story of My Childhood, was published in 1807. On April 12, 1912, Clarissa Barton died at the age of 90 at her home in Maryland. Her legacy now lives on through the current American Red Cross.